Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you are all doing well, whether you are listening live or on various podcast platforms. Welcome, nonetheless, to another episode of Do You Even Read, a show where Dimes and I go through various literature and philosophy and seeing just what the heck is going on with it and how can we make sense of it in today's challenging and strange times, also known as Clown World. Dimes, how the hell are you?
I'm doing good. I'm so happy to see the chat again for this one. We're back at it again, folks.
Yeah, and it's October 7th. We're in the midst of spooky season. So I know last time that we did this show, we had references to the Time Cube. Our friend Last Things was playing up the jokes and giggles for how scary this was, despite the fact that it was a pretty good time nonetheless. But yeah, we're back for part 2 of Thomas Moynihan's Spinal Catastrophism. We both really liked reading this text. I'm really glad that we get to cover it. I was reading the comment section on the last stream we did on this book, and I saw a pretty highly upvoted comment where he says, Dimes reviews the most hated book imaginable to his audience, Prude. Let's do it again. And it's like, yeah, I guess that's what we're doing, but I'm here for it. So we are live, both here as well as on X/Twitter, whatever you want to call it. I greatly appreciate the fact that you are all here listening, as well as on the VOD, commenting and all that other stuff is greatly appreciated to the algorithm gods. So we're going to start our discussion sort of as a recap. We went over the prospectus, the preface, and the thoracic retrospect, which was some of the least cited stuff, but this section, Lumbar Genesis 1900 to 1800, has the most citations out of the entirety of the text, and we have a lot of notes to cover through. But we left off sort of talking about how the thoracic retrospect section of this book kind of just lays the cart before the horse, and you don't really have the citation or the theory or what he's citing to back it up. You get a reference to an English American author, and then you get a reference to a guy who doesn't even exist.
Yeah, and that really comes up a lot more in this part. And I've always gone back and forth on how I feel about the CCRU and their employment of fictitious people. I think the line that I didn't get to say last time, but someone had quoted and reminded me of Daniel Barker was brought up, and the line something like, Daniel Barker has not existed and will not exist. And that's made very, very clear. And almost as like he's a spy or something from the future. Like, don't look into this guy. But he's sort of this fictitious figure. You permit him to give lore dumps for whatever it is that you're writing. So I do wonder if there's people in our spaces that could just borrow him from time to time. Like if you've ever needed to, and I'd like to see him in a debate. I'd like to see him the next time Academic Agent is debating someone, and take the biggest debate and start quoting Daniel Barker and just say, look it up. Just go Miskatonic Virtual University. It's all fucking there. I'm not going to hold your hand. Go look for it.
Honestly, I'm pretty sure we could do that, and I think we should start just referencing Daniel Barker as just this go-to. There's the meme about like it was revealed to me in a dream, and I think that if that were going to be the case, you could have a lot of fun with. Actually, no, we're referring to a gentleman who attended Miskatonic and taught at Miskatonic Virtual University. This is where Zero HP Lovecraft does his job.
How's my mic sounding now? They said my mic was low, and I just turned up the volume. So.
Oh yeah, let us know. Let me go. I can also edit audio settings here, mic settings. Oh, let's turn that off. Automatically adjust mic volume. There we go.
Okay, now let me know if it's way too loud. I'm not. Anyway.
Yeah, we'll figure it out. Okay, it says better. Great, cool.
Like, oh, fuck, I was gonna say something. What was it? Talking about Dan Barker. Anyway, we'll move on. We should invent more guys, is what I'm saying.
We should say that like Zero HP Lovecraft teaches English there at Miskatonic Virtual University.
Yeah, like why stop with one fake university? I mean, we have enough real fake universities on our side, I suppose.
Absolutely.
I'm not going to go down that path. I'm not going to say anything mean. This is a safe, clean stream.
Well, with that, do you want to just recap real quickly what we're going over for those who are tuning in for the first time?
Yeah, it's a good prompt because it forces me to summarize what we're talking about. And for people who are just joining us, where would we begin? Okay, so really what we're talking about is, and we'll get into the importance of upright posture, I guess, a bit more this time, but it's about the spine being a manifestation of trauma as memory, and the spine and the central nervous system basically being the engine which projects the entire universe, as we know it out from everything comes back to the upright posture that we have and the spine and its connection to almost I'm even starting to lose myself here. You see can you pick this up and make sense of it? So I got the spine and I'm trying to relate this to the earth about depth.
Yeah, so you
Depth is
have
memory.
the depth is memory, but also that the spine can serve as the not just as a proxy for mankind's evolutionary memory, but also as a sort of geological, archaeological record, as a way to measure, how does consciousness emerge, and what has happened throughout the history of the human species to get us to where we are. And we now have the technology to mimic the brain and consciousness, or we're attempting to. And what does that mean in regards to life, existence, being? And this text tries to explain that with references to Nick Land, George Bataille, Freud, early American psychiatrists, as well as various forms of catastrophism studies. So this goes back into the history of, say,
Yeah.
evolution and so on.
And also the one important thing, and this really is a thread throughout the entire book, it's, at least this is my interpretation, it's that trauma precedes everything. That all intelligence, and I don't really think you could say there's a God in this model of things, or maybe you could interpret one, but it's like trauma precedes everything. The universe almost is trauma, and intelligence emerges as trying to escape trauma, to try and predict trauma and navigate around it. So everything is an embodiment of trauma, but also us trying to remove ourselves from it, and the upward projection of the spine is us almost trying to escape it. And there's a real intertwining of like the metaphysical and the physical. Like it sounds like we're being, too abstract here, but like when we say the spine, literally the spine and your bones, like you are an embodiment of all this metaphysical stuff, is what he's getting at. And everything is a reaction to this essence called trauma. And there's people who reject that entirely. I've got friends. I'm thinking of the Sunflower Society. It was run by a good friend of mine named the Laughing Man. He rejects the 20th century psychoanalysis view of that trauma matters. That he thinks trauma, as we know it, is just something that was invented, but there's a way to devalue it or not be controlled by it. However, so if you reject the importance of trauma, you might reject this entire thing. But if we're going to be wading into these waters, that's where it starts, in my opinion.
Yeah, I would have to preface that this is a very materialist text. This is not one that's going to really take any sort of religious understanding, Christian or otherwise, with any sort of serious value. You're going to get a lot of the, I guess, sort of, post-structural, very Deleuzian schools of the CCRU and so on. And as we mentioned in the first episode, that this text's got a preface/introduction that was written by someone who was there with the CCRU and knew Nick Land personally back in the 90s. So you're going to get a lot of interesting references, but also if you are understanding or aware of where that kind of knowledge comes from, then this book will make a lot more sense. I mean, there are literal chapters that reference Nick Land's Fanged Noumena writing, so you'll have a lot of fun if you know any of that. But this book, yeah, I think is a perfect breakdown of it. Is that you're just going to take sort of the Plutonic's geotrauma sort of stuff, that the history of the Earth is wrapped in trauma and catastrophe. It doesn't really base itself on that sort of uniformitarianism of history and gradual increase in evolution. And in doing so, you can understand where we as a people come from, but also where our ideas of trauma and psychology come from.
Yeah, and this might be me reaching above my pay grade, but you can see how this would emerge from a very Hegelian point of view about everything being the intersection of conflict in the dialectic, whereas someone else might say that the universe emerges from the mind of God. Then there's the idea of logos and everything, but like this entire framework of viewing the universe is diametrically opposed, in my opinion, to first of all Christianity, but almost any other monotheistic religion inside. And I think you need to understand that's how you need to approach something like this. Like the essence of everything is tension, it's conflict, it's destruction, and you just live at that intersection. That's where reality is. That's my interpretation of it anyway.
Yeah, the meme that, destroy everything that exists. I think that you can kind of apply that here, that the history of the earth has been, in the history of the spine and our consciousness, is trying to survive a world that wants to destroy everything that exists.
Yeah, and so there is, and we're not going to get into this time, but this is kind of for the third one we're going to do. It's a very hostile way to look at the universe. It's very antagonistic towards the universe, because if you really delve into this, I wouldn't call it nihilistic, though, but I would say that it does view the universe itself as your enemy insofar as you're embodied of it, but you're also in perpetual rebellion against it, which is, again, kind of a strange way of looking at it, but that's the grounding of this entire thing. It's total hostility.
Oh, absolutely. The world is a hostile, evil place that wants to kill you. So we're going to move now on, I guess, into this section, which is Lombard Genesis, 1900 to 1800, with a lovely quote from Henry Maudsley, Physiology and the Pathology of the Mind, 1867. Like the brain, the spinal cord has memory. A spinal cord without memory would be an idiotic spinal cord. So what are your general thoughts then, I guess, for this section, and then we'll just break it down by the five little parts here.
I teased some of this on the first episode, but we might repeat ourselves at various points here. But I think you could read the first section of this book and be happy. You can go away and live your life. It's this section of the book where it gets really weird, where he starts drawing on other thinkers like George Bataille, and this is where you start to see your Edward your Barkers and all this, the background. This part is actually where it starts to get really, really weird, in my opinion. But it starts getting into also the nature of information. And like, to me, this is also where it gets more into the sci-fi stuff. And if you read any of the CCRU stuff, it's equal parts, philosophy, but then it just gets into strange flights of fancy and tales about like the nebula being hive minds and things like that. And you could probably have more fun with that, but it tends to just kind of leave it there and not really develop it too much. But you start getting a sense of the model of the universe, whereas the first section is just, here's your sort of Cartesian location as a human being within the universe. Now we're going to talk about how information lives in the universe and how that relates to what life is, which is a much bigger idea. But like you said, he borrows from everything from Freud to Bataille and others.
Yeah, and a lot of other figures who, and if you know your history of psychology and psychiatric medicine, then this is going to be sort of a who's who roundup. So like the first one that we have, it referenced out of the I guess right out of the gate, is going to be Eugene Bleuler, who died in 1939, a student of Freud's, or he knew Freud, and he's also the one who coins the phrase, or the term, schizophrenia. But also, you're going to get references to Velikovsky, who's considered a neo-catastrophist, and many people sort of just consider him like a pseudo-historical, pseudoscientific character. But again, in the United States, and also in sort of the greater archaeological record and of Earth history, that there has been a long-standing debate about catastrophe versus this sort of uniformitarian understanding of gradualism. And then, of course, once the Chicxulub impact site was discovered, then you've got a lot more other problems to deal with, because there are catastrophes that will radically alter the life cycle of the world, and have species that can disappear and so on and so forth. And now we get to apply that on a sort of micro, but at the same time macro scale of consciousness, memory, and trying to escape the trauma of existence.
Yeah, exactly. And I think We talk about catastrophism and catastrophists. Some people might know what that means, but he brings it up a few times in the book that it's the belief that life is guided by catastrophic events. And so there might have been a point in history where that would be unscientific, but I would argue that most people understand, especially if they're in our circles and they know about, the Younger Dryas impact. And there are these huge, massive cataclysmic events that seem to, whether or not you're a young earth creationist or not, there seems to be myths and scientific evidence of massive cataclysms that shape the direction of life on earth. So, I would argue that most people, in one sense or another, are catastrophists. It's just whether or not you think the universe is just catastrophe. But, like, you don't even need to subscribe to this ideology to understand that there's something there. There's something that it seems that so much of our mythologies, and he does get it in this in the book, but so many of our mythologies are grounded in cataclysms. So, even if you're not a kind of a post-left cyber goth guy, like you'll intuit that just by having a, cursory understanding of mythology.
Yeah, you're going to get a lot of references to that as well throughout this text. And again, I found reading this to be enjoyable because, again, if you don't have a religious understanding of the world or anything like that, then you're going to get a radical sort of breakdown as to what makes sense of the world. And I mean, this is one such example of that. But this allows us now to sort of just dive into. There are 5 sections to this chapter: posthumous praecox, ingraphy and ekphory, no brain required. Modernity is whiplash. German idealism and nature's most sublime flower, and cosmic history as a series of ossicles. So if you know your bones, you're gonna have fun here, and if you know your psychiatry, you're gonna have even more fun. So let me go bring up the text itself. But is there anything in this first section that you want to maybe dive into, or some interesting context that you want to read?
Let me just see here. I have to look at my notes. Maybe you could start, then I can kind of jump in.
Yeah, sure. So in this regard to no, this is not punctuated equilibrium. So for those in chat, this isn't necessarily that. This is more of the spine being an archaeological record that has trauma, but not quick spurts of evolution. So one of the things that I quite liked in this was the description of schizophrenia and its early descriptions being an orological sickness, meaning that this is regarding time. And prior to the use of the word schizophrenia being used, you had what was known as dementia praecox, which of course was just a proof that early in your age, teens, 20s, early 30s, that you could be exposed to various mental conditions that would lead to further degradation. And to me, that was really interesting to see that this is based in time, that these early psychiatric figures were thinking about this with a chronological understanding of the consciousness, but also our ideas of sentience being based in time. And I quite liked this orological aspect because, I mean, for me, it's always nice to see that being used, that particular term. But there's a quote here that I quite liked here, which was... I'll scroll to it here real quick. Yeah, here it is. One article published in The Lancet in 1902 focused on a schizoid postural stereotypes, prominent among them attitudes of crouching like a beast. Again, the malady was understood as a time sickness. And he references some records here. Researchers have argued that there's some sort of vestibular involvement that could be used to explain the perceived S-curve of schizophrenic posture. Such schizophrenic postures, along with other physical signs such as a shuffling gait, inflexibility of the neck and shoulders, and resting posture, were explained as a regression to primitive labyrinth reflex characterized by flexion, internal rotation, and adduction. And so these early patients of schizophrenia or dementia, they could have been other diseases, but again, we're talking 1902, the late 19th century, being regressions in our evolutionary posture. We're no longer the evolved present day Homo sapiens, but instead these mental conditions are regressions to previous states of humanity's existence, whether they're as bipedal hominids or even more regressive down to, say, our lizard brain, for example.
Yeah, like I can see the thread he's pulling there, because on our show, even, and for those in the listeners who might understand these books or have heard them before, Julian Jaynes, the Breakdown the Bicameral Mind, or even Mircea Eliade, when they talk about the mind of the ancient man, how it would be completely alien to what we understand now. Even McLuhan talks about this, and they talk about, the tribal mind that they, and Julian Jaynes actually pinpoints this as a now defunct section of the brain that at one point could have felt to those at the time that their mind was almost speaking directly to them, or they could, in their minds, hear the voices of their dead ancestors. So they were, hypothetically, at least in these outlooks, completely involved with the paranormal. They're directly interfacing with the paranormal. So they would hear voices. They would think they might have heard the voice of God or demons, or maybe they did, maybe they didn't, but there was a part of the brain that could have conceivably been for channeling that. So, if there's one issue that I have with this book and other books like this, is they seem to treat some of these psychological issues, and schizophrenia especially, as sort of a bucket they can put whatever the fuck they want into. Like, it's very rare that they have a acute understanding of what schizophrenia really is, and psychologists don't really understand it very well. It's a lot of things. It's a pretty broad diagnosis, so it could include hallucinations or it could not. It's just kind of the apex mental illness as we understand it, and it is a truly modern phenomena. However, the way they're defining it, sure, let's just go with that if it is indeed you hearing voices, that could be a regression to the ancient mind. But I also do think schizophrenia, as we understand, it's kind of just and this is one argument against modern psychiatry, is that they have something like schizophrenia which is too broad to, it's kind of like what dark matter is to cosmologists. It's just a convenient thing you can use to explain. You can point to and say that's what it is, but it's way more complex than you're giving it credit to. Anyway, that's my little rant there.
No, I think that's very true, because a lot of the texts that Moynihan is going to reference through here are very late 19th century, early 20th century understandings of the mind and psychiatry and mental chemistry. I've got some commentary on cerebrospinal fluid that we can get into later. One of the things that I really liked, and this is where when Dimes mentioned sort of the science fiction or the fantastical, maybe archaeofuturist forms of science that gets referenced here, there's this lovely reference, of course, to a handbook on spirit maladies right here in this German, Austrian references here, wherein Schul, seemingly in a moment of abandonment to enthusiasm, writes of schizoid mental states as being the delusional dream flowers of the spinal nerve tree from which they blossom, the hallucinations of an abnormally functioning sentience nerve.
I would scroll down and show them the image.
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah, here's your spinal flower, your dream flower, and the spinal nerve tree.
Your H.R. Geiger psychosexual
I was about to say
nightmare.
this is your face hugger right there. I think about that bit from Breaking Bad where he's just like, yeah, she draws vaginas and shit, and it's like, yeah, there it is. There's your dream, your dream vagina on the spinal nerve tree.
So many artists. O'Keeffe. So many artists across time have asked themselves, what if there was a rape vagina? And then that's how you get Alien.
Yeah, there you go. But I do like this phrase, though, the abnormally functioning sentience nerve, as if sentience was something that they could deliberately identify, that it came from this nerve. It's very much in this desire to find, I guess in particle physics, the Higgs boson, the God particle, like, why does these things only work when we consciously observe them? Can we find the reason why that's the case? Can we find that mental illness can be brought down to, oh, here is one nerve that we can point out in this particular part of the spine or the brain, and there we go, there's the answer. And it allows you, I guess, if you're operating on a philosophical fantasy plane, and really I think to some extent this is both philosophy, fantasy, and then also taking a concept like the archaeological, geological record of history and applying it to human consciousness. You're trying to find answers to something that if they reject any sort of, say, religious answer, Christian or otherwise, then this is where you're going to go. And in a pure materialist sense, like, no, we have nerves, we have a record, and we can prove it. And here's your result.
And if there's, and they love this idea of like, if here's the part of the brain that we can stab, and that's going to make you better. Or, okay, is there a strata of the earth that we can locate the earth's soul? Which, again, if you haven't read this book, will sound like an insane question, but makes a lot more sense once you've read it.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and again, I thought that this was particularly interesting because if I wanted to write a science fiction story, sentience nerves sounds like something I would definitely use. But from Velikovsky through Bleuler, the immortality of experience, the privately recorded biographies of our mental state and its spinal nerve tree, early psychiatrists and psychoanalysts were all drawing upon a notion of memory that had dominated the late 19th century thought. Therein, the idea of mnemonics had risen to the position of explaining the very tendency for universal matter to assume persistent form and exhibit regularities. Characteristics of this general trend, Charles Sanders Peirce asked, may not the laws of physics be habits gradually acquired by systems? In other words, might not the syncretistic shape of our universe be a question of habit formation and habit retention? Again, very much psychoanalysis. Here, memory and cosmogeny became the same thing, essentially making the universe something like a gigantic nervous system. An interesting theory, right? Like if I wanted to be a science fiction writer, I'd go here. But
and
this is again go ahead.
There's nothing. This is something that you get from a lot of these guys, where they end up sketching out something that sounds a lot like the mind of God. And that might sound like too much of a blunt instrument for this topic, but it's really not. And I might have mentioned this before. I'm sure I did. But even when you go into quantum mechanics and you go into, I mean, the example I'd read was when I was reading into quantum gravity, which isn't popular anymore. But it was trying to explain, once you get to the lowest level, like, sure, we have the particles, but what is the universe? What gives it matter? And it was explaining it as, the universe is something like an operating system, and what you are inhabiting is the memory of its own calculations manifested as this one almost ether. Like, this is a serious book on quantum mechanics, but they're trying to find new language to describe, like, oh, you're inhabiting a mind. Right. And that's basically what he's saying here. It's like, yeah, you're inhabiting sort of a memory of a nervous system. It's like, okay, yeah, like you're basically inhabiting a giant, intricately complex mind, or something that's projecting itself onto itself. Like they are describing something like, God, but they can't say that. So they have to have like these 7 other things that kind of amount in a weird Frankenstein's monster way of that. Anyway, that's another rant. That's just my interpretation of this, and I'm sure some people push back on that. But
well, I think he's also trying to just show you that if all you have is one particular area of study, and again, psychiatry being a relatively new sort of science, therapy, medical field, whatever you wish to call it. Some could say it's complete bunk, and I'm sure that there are many that would agree. But I think one of the things that you could say is that, when you have this new school of thought, you are trying to, as a naturalist or as a scientist or as someone who wants to understand the mind, that you're building a sort of Weltanschauung or a worldview or an understanding that this study, this school, this discipline can actually explain all things in which our previous models couldn't. And we can look inside ourselves to find answers outward. Kind of like, we have inner secret knowledge inside of our bones, that we have an archaeological, osteo record of like, the gnosis is hidden inside the spine sort of deal. And they're trying to make an understanding of that. But again, it's only through their school and their discussion. It's very similar in a way to kind of like these online political communities. It's like the joke being like, oh, it's the same 30 guys in the same 50 group chats. It's the same 30 psychiatrists all talking to themselves in letters and coffee shops in Vienna or New York. And these are the kind of things that they come up with to understand the world around them.
And also, you touch on something there, and this was my favorite part of the first section of the book. And I was talking before about how there's elements of this book that are, really based on science, and I think you can take them seriously. It's not just weird science fiction stuff, but one of the things he mentions, this grounds a lot of what he's talking about now, is that when a human is conceived and born, they proceed through all the steps of our own evolution. You know, like we start off as a sperm and we start off as an embryo. For a period, we have a tail, then we lose that tail, and then, you know, we gestate, and then we're on all fours for a while, whereas a lot of animals are born fully walking. But to become an adult, you almost have to proceed through every step of your own species evolution. And I thought, so we are like, we're living through the memory of our own evolution every time we're born. So there's something there. There's something about having to reenact these memories, and we're not just born fully formed. And I think that is more distinct to humans than any other species.
Yes, and I think that is an important thing to understand when trying to make sense of the rest of this book. Is, well, why aren't we, you know, so why are we developed differently, and how can we explain it? And can our mental state, because we are so different in terms of having sentience and self-perception and this constant awareness that we're going to die one day, can that help explain the world around us, and why some of us are a little crazy and some of us are, you know, geniuses and so on?
Can I also just take a minute and have a look at some of these chats that I'm seeing?
Oh, sure, absolutely.
I love them. We got, who do we got here? We got, you know, CG Constantine here, where he's like, I want to write a science fiction story, but I won't use sentient nerves. Bill Wilson says, I shouldn't stick my dick in the spinal alien flower vagina. However, we got Vaughn here saying,
can you blame him? Can you blame him?
He says, Vaughn here, you got to be mechanicus maxing, reject external flesh, embrace only spine, skull, and steel. I mean, find the lie. And then we got my good friend Vulpus Persona here doing his Groiper bit, O'Keefe spinal flower Groiper. We got Groiper memes all over the place here, and I love every single one of them. I see every single one of them.
I like this one. Nutcracker has been out how long now? So true.
Oh yeah, and also got CG Constantine. Prude, we know you are in 50 group chats, as am I.
That is so true. I am in 50 group chats. I'm actually not. I try to reduce the number of GCs I'm in, but I am in a few.
You should just be like Geo and be a part of every group chat, but never talking any of them.
Maybe that's why it takes forever for him to reply to people.
He won't reply when you're telling him important things that he's asked for. You gotta I gotta threaten him.
It's okay. It's okay. We only found out what the title of tomorrow's Digital Archipelagos show is going to be because he messaged me earlier. Mage from the NPC, the Mage NPC from Elder Scrolls Arena. You are looking at the delusional dream flower of a spinal nerve tree. We are going through Thomas Moynihan's Spinal Catastrophism.
It says what it is right there.
Yeah,
it's
figure 19. But we can carry on here. So yeah, this section is pretty clear. Again, just like trying to understand what the universe is. And then later in this one, especially about postures being a sign of the past, you get into engraphy and ekphory, no brain required. And this is where you get some really interesting discussions that I think have some applicability to maybe right-wing politics. Despite the fact that I know Thomas Moynihan would be very upset that two right-wingers are going over his book. But hey, we found it interesting, and Death of the Author used to be a cool thing.
Well, that's a good question, because I followed some of his more recent stuff, and his recent work doesn't really deal with this at all. It was more extinction-level events on Earth. So I never got a full grasp on how he would feel with like a couple of characters like us getting into it. What do you think he would hate it?
I think so. I mean, when we were prepping for the first show on this book, we were going through, I was reading through Plutonics, and how everyone they view Nick Land like a Judas Iscariot character. They think that because Nick Land became a right-winger, or he's like, he flirts with the alt-right, that they're like, well, we can build upon his work and he can stay in the annals of like schizo history, and we will be the inheritors of this like new kind of analysis, which is interesting, because I'd imagine that like if you were coming out of like Deleuzian, post-left, or even like, post-Marx, post-Freud theory, that I would be upset that like the greatest mind of my generation was running stark naked through the Negro streets and realizing it's a zombie apocalypse and the right-wingers were right.
Well, to me, like if you're the originator of something like this, you're post politics. Like if you take this seriously, you're on a different fucking dimension.
Oh, I
man.
would agree
Like,
wholeheartedly. But
like even
again,
Nick Land, I'm like Nick Land, like he shitposts on Twitter. I'm like, I don't think for a second that he would like engage with a lot of these ideas. He's on another wavelength.
Yeah, his epistemology is on a different level. I would definitely agree with that in that respect. But I think that it's really funny. in respect to all these other people, I think that they have to kind of signal, like politically, because we're all still political animals at the end of it all. I don't think anyone's truly post-political, because politics, whether you like it or not, is just an application of intelligence to your environment and how you respond to that. Which is why I think that when Nick Land wrote in The Dark Enlightenment that just like, or no, it was in Xenosystems, that discrimination is just intelligence applied to the survival instinct. We
were talking about this earlier, where if you're truly a respecter of democracy, you only vote for voting.
Yeah.
That's the only candidate you write in. You vote for voting itself. That's what I do.
Absolutely. That's what you should do.
I cast my vote for me filling in a vote.
Absolutely. I'm glad this
is a smart stream.
We're going to have a fun time. So here we go. In order to explain this theory of the phylopsyche in the 1920s, Eugene Bleuler would borrow generously from the late 18th century of organic memory, or mnemonic psychology. Prior to the emergence of proper genetic theory or mechanism of inheritance, this briefly influential school of thought had attempted to explain instinctual behavior by collapsing biographical memory into biological heredity, casting both modalities of matter's universal tendency toward inscription. And so this I thought was particularly interesting because you have the opportunity to talk about blood memory or biospirit or things that like sort of like the right-wing esotericists would talk about that was sort of being explored in this sort of like naturalist psychiatric understanding of the world back in the 1910s and 20s. And my notes were simply as memory is a universal function of organized matter, and that history or blood memories, this not just applies to, say, particular groups or cultures, but this is a universal thing that happens across all of human races and cultures and the traumas that they may have experienced, and that what's in our blood actually can contain a potential record that could be, say, digitized to explain what that group or that person and their ancestry has gone through. Like some esoteric stuff, but like think about like deep time or deep history, or even like deep history in terms of psychometry from the Foundation series from Isaac Asimov. Like you can think that far ahead into the future by going and modeling that far back into the past, that you can implant these people or memories or ideas 5,500 years from now. And you have a record of it. Very interesting.
Yeah. And again, this isn't something that would sound heterodox to even most libs, because they'll accept it. You could give them a Reddit type factoid that says, hey, did you know that human beings can differentiate more shades of green than any other color? Well, why is that? Well, at some distant past when we were, I guess, all in a fucking jungle, you had to identify snakes and you had to identify things in the foliage. And so, well, that is blood memory. Like, why do we have that skill? So they will accept that. And all I can say is, well, just apply that to anything else. And maybe not just trauma, because you have trauma, yes. Survival instinct, yes. Can it be anything positive? Can it be anything else adaptive? So, and it depends on what your patience level is to hold them through this entire thing. But it's not something that people will be unfamiliar with. Is it like blood memory sounds like something a far right person will be into? But like up where I am in Canada, you'll hear Aboriginals talk about blood memory all the fucking time, especially if they're oral tribal cultures. They'll say like, yeah, we just have, of course you have ghosts in your blood. Like how the fuck do you operate? So to them, it's obvious, but I think it's something we need to relearn.
Well, and that also goes back into communication. You and I had talked about this with Harold Innis, right? You have how time is perceived between different cultures. like the paper space, time versus space-based communication, where if you're an oral culture, your time perception goes back far deeper because these are traditions that go back intergenerationally, and this is where you get some stories of Aboriginal peoples having like an alleged oral history that goes back like 10,000 years or so. And then whereas space, or it's time-based communication requires records, constant outpouring of data points to refresh the memory, and it's good for records and empire management, but it's not good for deep history and recommendation. And I think that you have this sort of stuff here as well, that like actually there is a spatial form of history that goes back millennia inside your blood and inside the spine.
Yeah, and he expands on that, I believe, in this part of the book, where the universe. I think it was a quote that I mentioned last episode, and it's here. We're going to get to it in a second, but it was one of the references saying that the universe, most of the universe, isn't empty. In fact, it's so full of life. Every minuscule area of the universe, even the expanse of space, is full of life, and so everything remembers everything. So you have this proliferation of memory. And that's an interesting way of looking at it. That's like I got a very young son, so sometimes we'll watch Toy Story, and the idea that the toys are alive, was always a very critical thought as a young boy, even myself. Like, what if they come alive when you turn your back? What Thomas Moynihan dares to ask is, what if your fucking insulation also comes alive when you're not looking? What if the clouds and the tires? What if everything has life and memory to it? What if the whole fucking universe is Toy Story? No one's ever asked that shit before.
There you go, right? And again, I think that this is where finally we're getting into what can explain spinal catastrophism. And this is why, if you thought the first part of this book was completely just being thrown this obscure random idea that would only be invented after a hit of PCP and methamphetamine and weed, then finally you have the theory behind your praxis and so on. But I find these two terms that you're going to get about memory, like the trace of your memory, inscription, which is the engraphy, and then the ekphory, which is the recalling of that memory. And again, I think that this is also trying to explain instinct. This is before we really get evolutionary psychology and evolutionary understanding for why the hand is the way that it is, or why our eyes are the way that they are, or why certain fangs on saber-toothed tigers may have actually been to decapitate through the occipital nerves of the human skull. But here we get some interesting terms. And again, these are people from the 1910s and 20s and that are brought into today. So one of the things I thought was interesting, of course, is engrams. So engraphy, their study of ekphory for recall. And this is based off Richard Simmon, who worked inside along numerous other German psychiatrists. But you're getting into biological heredity. You're getting into psychiatry on the evolutionary scale. And again, this is all in the midst of backdrop of Freud, Ferenczi, Carl Jung, and also Charles Darwin. That also, if we have a conscious evolutionary history in our memories, this also implies that there is a subconscious, something that might be accessible while we sleep, form of history that is built into the body and built into it, the various complexes of remembrance and forgetfulness. And this leads itself into a vision of nature as a great system of retention. You're not just retaining some other things there, Vril Maxers, but you're also retaining your memories.
No, I agree with that completely. I'm just reading ahead here, too.
Oh, sure. No. Some fun things in here are going to be about like psychoplasm and neuroplasm. We'll get into that in just a second here. But essentially that, one of the things is that we have memories being laid down as a physiological micro alterations to the central nervous system, as well as the cerebrospinal fluid. We have a chronologic stratification. So while Seaman having paved the way for a generalized physiology of memory, scientists were soon raving about how spinal cords are endowed with memory. They are indeed nothing but ossified memory, deposited lamina upon delicate lamina. One such researcher, Theodule Armand Ribot, claimed that memory is essentially a biological fact, accidentally a psychological fact. Like the brain, spinal cords has, so to speak, its memory. And remember, if certain things are stored in the balls, that your memory is stored in the cerebrospinal fluid of your central nervous system.
If there's one takeaway from this episode, let that be it. No, but that's an interesting point where it's sort of the subsuming of intelligence into everything. So it's like, your psychology, your mind is it comes after the memory of your spine. Like it's just your memory is an appendage to like the civilizational and genetic memory of your body, which is a complete inverse of how many other people would view that.
Yeah, and again, you're going to get some fun terms here in just a minute. I think one of the notes that I took was right down here towards with respects to referencing William S. Burroughs, but Samuel Butler, who translated Henry, championed entropy as putting the backbone into the theory of evolution. Again, evolutionary psychology being mentioned here. In his book Unconscious Memory, Butler talked about enthusiastically of the memory of the nervous system, averring recollections that contain even within sympathetic ganglion systems are no less rich than those of the brain and spinal marrow. Within Butler's grand and graphic vision, the inverted organism is nothing but a compacted memeplex of nature's universal past, expressed physically via stacked ganglion laminae. A body is nothing but glaciated time, and the central nervous system, its read-write entropy-ecrophy relay. Basically, how we see people on like atheists on Twitter be like, we're all space dust floating through a rock through space at millions of miles an hour. The materialist psychiatric reduction of evolutionary psychology and hereditary instincts and traits is that the human mind is nothing more than a memeplex, a history of ideas brought down inside the brain and the central nervous system. Where you see all those people that will post sort of like the nervous system and like the eyeballs. He's like, this is you. And it's like, well, that's what they're saying. But on a not really a deeper level, but just on the concept of memory and time and history and instinct, you are the history of what the nervous system has evolved to become and what it will become in the future.
And let me just say this, if there's one, and maybe this will change by the time we get to part 3, but I remember when I first read this, I never liked the phrase that the spine is ossified time. Like he deals with so many other ideas here, but say like, oh, like you are a manifestation of time. That always sounded clumsy to me. Like it doesn't make sense. And the more I try and explain it, the less sense it makes. You know what I mean? Like just to say like, oh, the spine is like stacked time. Like I don't know. That just seems awkward to me. What do you think?
I think what they're trying to get at is that the spine is a rock formation, because what is a geological record of history but ossified or glacial time? I think is what they're trying to get at. They're simply saying like if we can explore and go back in time through these core samples of rock or through a sedimentary layer of history in the millions of years, why can't the same thing be applied to a record of time that is in our bones? And obviously the central nervous system can contain that sort of geographic record, geological record. So to me, I don't really hate the phrase or the term. I think that if I'm trying to break it down to its rawest psychiatric materialism, that the human mind is glaciated time that over the course of millennia and hundreds of years will react to new stimuli and senses. And of course, as we talked about in the first episode, because we can accelerate that time and that perception of time, and I joked about it last in our first episode, where how like kids will read about like the eventual proposed model that the sun will like blow up in 5 billion years, and then they go into an existential crisis over something that they won't live to see. And so, but again, because we now have the capability to perceive, and this is what leads into Moynihan's second book, is because we have essentially outsourced our prediction, our modeling, our ability to predict the future on a scale that is well beyond our traditional record of time. And we're going to get into that with the Whiplash chapter, that we can essentially envision our own extinction. And this is where you get like Nick Bostrom's vulnerable world hypothesis and so on. So now we have a memeplex of ideas that now can be stretched out outside of human existence or outside of our own record as a species. And on a materialist lens, that should terrify the shit out of you. And this is where you get like the in-group versus out-group preference, because I think a lot of liberals and a lot of lefties and a lot of post-political people have that out-group preference, where they're not thinking about themselves or the nation or race or whatever. They're thinking about the world, the species, the Earth as a planet, as this like, we must preserve Gaia at all costs because we know how delicate it is, and we have all these models that tell us how delicate it is. There go. The mind virus inside of me says we must defend this over anything that would be in the immediate context of humanity. And if you believe in sort of that long-term planning, ironically, the best piece of fiction that kind of covers this, in my personal opinion, isn't Foundation. It's actually, oh goodness, what is it called? It's going to bother the crap out of me that I just said that and I don't remember what it's called. Arcanum. You know, the steampunk CRPG from the late 90s, early aughts, where like the dwarves hate humans because we think in our limited time frame, whereas they live for hundreds of years, and they're like, you stupid humans with your technology and your Bill Gates stand-in, you've ruined the earth, and we live longer than you. We'll see the consequences. You'll never live to see it because you're so afraid to die because you live so short. I think that's kind of what you see here, is that glaciated time, that we have this record, but now we can't perceive as far ahead.
I'm going to ask a dumb guy question, and I leave this open to you or anyone to answer, because there's the relationship between the spine as sort of ossified time and also the planet and the layers of the planet going down to the core, falling inward as falling into its own history. You descend into the planet and you descend through its history, which makes sense if you know how a planet's formed from the core and then from the inside out. But then it would stand to reason that as you descend down the human spine, you're going further back in time, which would imply that 2,000 years in the future, our spines should be extremely long. And if they're not, then what the fuck does the spine have to do with anything? You see what I'm saying? Where it's like, it's not obvious to me that if you go, I see what he's saying when you stand erect, the head's at the top, and that's sort of the apex. But like, if I go down to my tailbone, is that really, he's saying it's literally going back in time, and I get metaphorically what he means, but also materialistically, that doesn't make any fucking sense when compared to the Earth. Like, I don't know, like, again,
see, now, because now I want to interview him and say, like, hey, man, do you think you stretched this metaphor a little bit?
Really, it needed to be said. I'm sure some other people had thought that, but thinking, no, like, hey, I'm not going to ask a fucking spinal 101 question here, but really, as we're going through this again, I'm like, wait a minute, that's not how the spines work. Fucking asshole.
Wait a second.
You fucking, you non-chiropractor son of a bitch.
But again, so then we get a everyone from like George Bataille to Nietzsche to Edward von Hartmann is going to get referenced here. And some of this is pretty interesting, like Hartmann talking about how, like, again, the spine is a mnemonic ladder providing pathways into prehistory of the cosmogonic unconscious. Following contemporary physiological understanding, Hartmann stressed the ontogenetic and phylogenetic parallelisms of the development of a centripetalizing cephalization. The whole nervous system arises both phylogenetically and embryogenetically from a peripheralized and decentralized nervous nets towards consolidation upon the encephalizing brain, he observed. But in both the development of individuals and the species, Hartmann saw successive waves of centralization, threading of ganglionic cells upward and rising into spinal centers, and then leading, of course, to individuation. And this is what he means by that. So you have the fish, and then you have the amphibian, right? You see how these things are piling on top of one another, the bird, the mammal, and now man. So olfactory, optic, acoustic, the human brain and its gradual development, this repetition of forms, these cells centralizing from decentralized little nets on top of themselves. This is what he means.
Yeah, it's I didn't know this about Hartmann. Like, he goes into the history of Hartmann, who was mentioned alongside Hegel, apparently, and then was buried by Nietzsche. I don't know any of the philosophical history there, but if I'm taking that, so I hope it's not a guy he invented. It might be, but let's assume that.
No, I looked him up to make sure he was real.
you got to do that stuff. Like there's some interesting history there. We don't need to necessarily go into that, but yeah, this stuff kind of got lost to time.
Yeah, he died in Berlin in 1906, so he was real. We can say this time. There's no Miskatonic University extension in Berlin this time. We're safe. But they're trying to explain these things like sleepwalking or these other internal neuroticisms or psychological conditions. Actually, this is a record. This is proof of the past that we did these things as a former species. Like they're like, it's the Pepe Silva meme. It's just like, see, look at all these things that tie together, these inner body experiences. And again, we get a reference to Ballard again and all the rest.
We have an interesting comment here by Hazael. Says the brain is where the spine is. Presently, the spine is where it used to be. That sounds about right. I get, at least with
your brain comes pre-packaged with 2 fragile nodules. Very true.
Yeah, and also a comment here from Marbly. Well, the nerves in the spine converts abstract thinking into movement, and is in fact movement which allows you to experience time. The quadriplegic lives without time. He's always in one time or place. That I don't know if that's medically true, but that could be true. That sounds interesting to me.
Yeah, I actually kind of like that idea that we have, because I guess we're higher above the ground, we have more nerves, we have this greater centralization of ganglia. We allow ourselves to perceive time because we can move through it, because we can perceive it, unlike an animal that doesn't have its clock ticking in the way that humans do. We have that biological clock, ladies, but also that you have this concept that like, oh, one day this is it for me. I will die. There are very few animals on Earth that have that. I mean, elephants have their burial grounds and they do mourn. And of course, the dolphin and the whale have this to some extent, but not to the degree that we do. And of course, for numerous species, it's just autonomic, right? Like, oh, it's this time of year, ergo I must mate. And it's not with any greater understanding of choice or like, maybe I won't do it this time. Or, oh, maybe I'll just decide to like commit mass suicide by like, the pill or whatever. Like there's all these differences. And I think there's, maybe metaphysically that's true.
Also, 2 more things. One, I noticed that I may have inadvertently kicked off a debate on chiropractic. I did not intend to grant any validity to chiropractors. I don't know what the fuck is going on when it comes to the spine. I just saw chiropractor as a spine guy. That's as much as I meant. But I also wanted to point to a comment here made by Johnson. I believe this to be true. He says the CCRU is diagrammatic. They don't do metaphor.
Oh, well, there you go. That's true. That is true. Maybe metaphor is the wrong word, but I mean, you're just using this particular model or diagram. And we mentioned it's on the bloody, what's the word I'm looking for? It's on the bloody thumbnail for the video. I mean, it is a diagram. But I mean, even if it's not meant to be allegorical or metaphorical, like this is our diagram. Got it. Cool. But on a linguistic level, I guess the question would be, can you stretch it far enough? And I'm looking at it that way because, I read more than I look at diagrams. And my perception, of course, is as an Excel spreadsheet monkey in my day job, is that I have to do a lot of math and do a lot of numbers and do a lot of projections. So, I mean, this is why also this is interesting to me, because this is about projection. This is about the understanding and modeling of things, which is what I do more so with money and projects than the human mind, soul, and body. But again, this speaks to my fancy because I've read Schopenhauer, I've read Nietzsche. Get some interesting stuff here.
Well, we have enough friends in our circles that believe that money and finance is the shared mind of civilization. So you're tapped into it.
So the Schopenhauer bit was really cool to me. I don't know what your thoughts were, but he says...
I was just about to get to that, yeah.
Oh, yeah, because this to me was like a really cool thought or idea. So Schopenhauer himself had theorized that dreams are caused when the sleeping brain, starved of external stimuli and input from sensory organs, makes up this by intercepting interoceptive messaging from the lower spinal regions and converting such signal into the brain's own native language, that of a spatio-temporally extended 3-dimensional world. In other words, when we dream, we literally inhabit a spinal landscape.
Yeah, I had no idea, and he has some other quotes and some other philosophers here. I had no idea how many great minds had commentary on spines. If these quotes are indeed true, I have no reason to believe that they're not true, but it was surprising that Schopenhauer And I've only read a bit of Schopenhauer. I only read the Will and Representation, but yeah, I didn't know he had thoughts on where dreams come from the spine. But that's apparently a common line of inquiry with these guys.
Yeah, I mean, well, I think also because this was we talk about it on Twitter, right? Like, oh, I almost stepped into some discourse. But when this was like when psychiatry was the disciplinary the discourse dot trademark dot jpeg, right? Like this, you had to have a commentary on it. Like it's when like random people on Twitter or on our in our chats or whatever will ask us, oh, what is your thought about this? And it's like, well, I don't fucking know. Like now I gotta go read about it and give you an informed opinion based off like my half-assed research or whatever. But I mean, these guys spent their time seriously looking at this and reading through their texts because these were much better men than ourselves to a large part, that they were saying like, okay, well, this is what we have. So, dreams are part of this proto-cognitive autonomy to the spine. Like the spine used to be all that we had. And when we lay on our backs, we regress into this like floating little like fish thing in the ocean. And that's how we're going to be. And we go back in time when we sleep. And dreams are ways for these old regressive cognitive ideas to emerge into to the brain and speak to the consciousness, which is why it's so difficult for us to remember our dreams. But how I wrote on my notes was that dreams, these are the spinal landscape. This is where we can get the dream-like quality of a liminal space. And that because we are deprived of external stimuli, we are only left with the autonomic records and history of what our brain can perceive, and now only being decoded and projected onto our mental screen, if you will, by
you touched on something cool there. The back rooms as a spinal landscape.
That's what my first thought was like a liminal space. That because it's like running. This is a terrible analogy or whatnot, but it's like when we dream, we're trying to process something with a shitty graphics card. Like it's not the best computing power because it's archaic. It's the spine. It's not the brain. It's not the central nervous system at the top of the head. So instead, I'm having this older, crappy, Windows 95 tech try to process information that my Intel 9000 IK plus my 4070 RTX card is going to tell me all about.
Look at this shit. Fucking Moynihan, get over here. You're not going to get shit like spinal landscape backrooms from the Kamala Harris voters. You're going to get it from over here.
It's very true. It does depend if it's a non-REM or a REM dream. That is true. That is true.
Derek dead. All this spine talk is making me hungry for spines.
Step out of the way, ribs.
We really hit a nerve. We hit a nerve with the spine stuff. There's a lot of people with good spine riffs. I didn't know there was so much lurking out there.
We've got a lot of good. Every stream allows the chat to turn into a writer's room.
Because, like, if you think about it, almost everybody in the world has a spine. So why couldn't they have a galactic memory to draw from?
Well, this is where you also get, and we talked about this at the first episode, which was, wouldn't this play very well into the concept of the new sphere?
Yeah, well, also, like, really the fascinating element of all of this, and there's a way you could like tie this together with a lot of stuff that you and me and others in our circles are interested in, which is like a very strange spatialization of these concepts, like the spatialization of like the mind as the universe, but also as your spine, everything except a soul, and then just the way we could actually, for many of us, could actually picture this really fucked up. And like you had said, like Johnson said, the CCRU, they diagram things. We diagram things. This is literal. This is something you could sketch out as it's none of it is that paranormal or spiritual. It's something you could draw a fucking map of. And that, I don't know, it's just such a wild thing that you can like inhabit this space, not as an ideology or a religion or anything, but it's just like, it's not science either. It's like a new type of pop metaphysics. I don't know what else you would call it.
Yeah. Our friend Sean Schaefer asks through Entropy with $3. He says, does this mean God is a chiropractor? I guess if you wanted to extend this diagram to have an outside creator of the spine, and it not being formalism, after all, it is a catastrophic lens of history and archaeology, then yeah, I guess that would put God as a chiropractor to adjust the spine and to reorient it towards its will.
As you age and your mind begins to deteriorate, as does your spine. Coincidence?
Mm.
Coincidence? Oh, I think
not. That's an interesting question. Yes, yes. When chat is the way that it does turn into verbal onanism. It is very masturbatory. But we love you anyways, you sick perverts. We love you anyways.
I'm just happy we're making time for the chat.
Absolutely.
I want this immortalized.
It will be a good time. So I think the last parts for this section that I thought were particularly interesting was talking about Hartman thus compared the brain to a mere factory foreman on top of a grand assemblage that more or less runs itself. One cannot think of here as such ailments as alien hand syndrome, where limbs appear to manifest a will of their own. The right hand doesn't know what the left is doing. Entirely separate from, or even antagonistic to, the brain's executive processing function. Hartman's physiolophilosophy clearly makes room for the conceptual possibility of alien spine syndrome. This is Francis E. Deck shit. Just as the 19th century institution of the factory simultaneously made possible the strike and labor militancy. And as Lawrence, of course, would later announce, revolutions roll upwards from the oldest salamandrine portions of the spine.
Now here's the politicization of this entire thing.
Yes.
And it's sort of like the capitalist critique of spinal catastrophism.
Well, also at the same time, too, that you're noticing that I would argue this is more historiography in the sense that these concepts only roll around in the midst of the political reaction to the Industrial Revolution, because mankind is completely reorganized during the Industrial Revolution away from its feudal tendencies to its more industrial ones. And this is where you get the Marx command society versus the control society that Deleuze talks about. And so what are we now examining in the midst of all this is, well, can we apply this to the human body? Are we looking outside stimuli, and can we apply this towards ourselves physiologically? And even then, right, when they're talking about medicine, well, the Enlightenment brings about medicine, the industrialization brings about a revolution in medicine. And so questions about spinal industries and spinal function are used, remains obscure until the Enlightenment. And then we start talking about how the sentience, the sentience principle actually being autochthonous with the backbone, or basically the spine is where sentience can emerge. We have sensory motor pathways. All these things are only now beginning to be brought up because we have the technology to literally vivisect puppies. Very similar to what Dr. Fauci would do with those beagles. And poke at nerves to see what changes. And now we have motor pathways, and this is where you sort of get these naturalist or old-fashioned understandings. And some could say that they're still applicable, like phrenologists, but Magny was in particular exemplar of an evil scientist known for his extremely gruesome and cruel methodologies of vivisection. But I mean, hey, this is where we get these ideas from.
Yeah, as he goes further, he mentions Marshall Hall here. He says that Hall found that many processes from respiration to vomiting work in this way, almost as automatic functions. And this is what Marvin Minsky was
No
finding.
brain required.
Yeah, well, basically, it's like, okay, you view the mind in his book, A Society of Mind, like what is the mind? And he shows how from infancy, the mind begins to develop and it starts creating, and this is a very programmatic industrial revolution way of looking at it, but it's just automatic functions that build up to more automatic functions. And that as a child, and if you have children, you can see them do this, they have to manually learn how to do very basic things, like how to grab something. Eventually they level up and they relegate a lot of these basic motor functions that they once had to learn and concentrate on to just muscle memory. And as you age, you relegate more and more things to muscle memory, and you build more and more complex tasks. And you can connect these together with what we call K lines. And I'm not going to get into the whole K line thing, but basically that's a neural pathway that remembers groupings of automatic functions that it can just call on very simply to accomplish a more complex task. And what he found is that it's extremely difficult. And there's some people who contest against Marvin Minsky's model of the mind, especially as it relates to artificial intelligence, because they tried to take that and build artificial intelligence on it, but they can never build something that is equitable to a human intelligence that way. However, I still think there is some truth to it. But what he found was at a certain level of maturity, it's very, very difficult to step back down into those processes. Like once you learn how to like walk left foot, right foot, it feels weird to think about yourself walking. It's like discombobulating once you start thinking about, if I were to tell everyone in the chat that you are now breathing manually, I bet that would be very jarring, right? But that is what it is. Like you are in that sense, and just to relate this back to spinal catastrophism, that would be in essence you regressing back through your own mental model to a more simple form and trying to manually work on these automatic functions.
Yeah, and so again, like you get the spinal soul, or later on we get the reference to about Nietzsche, which I thought was some really interesting stuff, right? We have where is it here? Yeah, so basically, going away from muscularism rather than legalism, the brain is a jumped up bureaucrat. Ergo, we should look at things differently. We should look towards the muscle rather than the brain. But also, with respects here, where is it that or in my notes here that Nietzsche writes that logic itself is a kind of spinal cord for vertebrates, and that logic, has these assumptions or these groundworks, a foundation like the bones of the spine that work their way up to make conclusions as to how the world makes sense. And so this is where you get the agonism from Kant, right? About holding contradictory beliefs, but one person can't actually do that, and one has to be true. And we're building off of Hegel here, as well as Schopenhauer and Nietzsche. The pipeline of personhood isn't a legal run in a logical game, the mutually bolstering and bureaucratic pitter-patter of I think, you think, so much it is a noisy parliament of proto-brains strung down the spine, which is Nietzsche's guiding thread and understanding of logic and thought, according to Moynihan. Do you have any notes for this part?
I don't have any notes, but I do just have some thoughts there. It's interesting that there's such a focus on linearity in this book when, where it ends up is sort of this almost immersive, multi-dimensional, multitudinous existence. But like the spine is, not only is it a manifestation of time, but it's a manifestation of linear time. And if you really wanted to go deep into this sort of thinking, you would say, well, is the future not having just a linear spine? As we advance our understanding of time, would it mean that eventually our spines break off into more of something like a web? And he kind of gets to that later when he talks about how intelligences embody their environments on a more advanced level. And so you have intelligences inhabiting nebula. But, I would ask him, like, is humanity destined to remain a spine? Is humanity, because he says that outright. He's like, the future of humanity, the perfect human, would be just a head and a spine floating. But why would that be the case? Would we not have to break from our linear understanding of time once we get to the more advanced level? But that's just a thought that I had as I was reading it.
Well, and I think that that's an interesting thing to consider when we get to the third part where we talk about where this book leads you. But when you're trying to explain the history of trauma inside a species, but also like a consciousness, whether it's collective or just an individual one, we thread ourselves together, as Nietzsche writes, not by way of regulative rules, but along the willful arcs of the segmental spine. We should search for the hydraulic behind the synthetic unity first through this guiding thread of the body. Quoting him, saying, our life is possible through the interaction of many intelligences highly unequal in value, and thus only through a continual thousandfold obeying and ordering stated in moral terms through the uninterrupted exercise of many virtues. How could one stop speaking morally? To speak morally is to speak belatedly and inertially. However, even if one cannot help doing so for Nietzsche, there is something already superseded in talking in this way. When talking in morality, it is the illusions of the pallid and hierarchic past that speak through us, a past already outstaying its welcome, already outmoded by some inevitable point of future dissolution. Nietzsche's thought is self-consciously a prelude to a philosophy of the future, after all. And you notice this when you read the introduction to his text, Antichrist, that it was originally supposed to be like one part of 4 to have a philosophy and an understanding for the world of the future. So
yeah, he says here,
I didn't know that he had so much to talk about spine. And, because if you go to 41 here, this is just a collection of his works that I from the 1970s that I haven't read, and I've read Ecce Homo, I've read Beyond Good and Evil and Antichrist and Genealogy of Morals, but I guess I'd have to reread it. Maybe it's in one of those.
Yeah, I read to get back to Nietzsche because I read a lot of Nietzsche in high school when you should. But I do want to go back and give it, a proper treatment because I've read other thinkers as well. But, I haven't read Genealogy and Morals. That sounds like that would be more in line with my thinking here. But even in this paragraph here, it sounds like they're at odds with, because if you take this at what it is, which is that we're a manifestation of time in this hierarchy, then that would almost be an argument for traditionalism. But he also says that, that's the illusions of the pallid past overstaying its welcome. It's, well, why? Why isn't it, in that sense, why isn't tradition the political manifestation of the spine? You know what I mean? But he also, because of their political inclinations, they also want to treat that as, no, you don't need to give a shit about morals either. But I'm like, well, I mean, I'm following your logical train here, but anyway.
Well, it's a great way to transition to the third part, which is about whiplash and railway spine. And we get to talk about just time here in general. So really the only thing I really had, and I guess we can make this part a little quicker and we can get to the last two parts, although I don't have too much to say about German idealism. I have more to say about cosmic history. But so this section talks about just our perception of time and how the brain and our consciousness sometimes have difficulty in the perception of time. So, for instance, a modern ailment, railway spine, a post-traumatic condition attributed to the abrupt lurch of the global transport networks, then piecing themselves together, caused by significant jolts of acceleration, sometimes experienced in early train carriages. Railway spine was, just like whiplash during the automobile age, an elusive and baffling illness that was more of an invention of contemporary medico-legal incentives and cultural fears than a real neural disorder. And then later on, it sort of talks about how railway spine was actually an illness of time, a chronobiological ailment. The English psychologist James Sully had written that since the nervous system has been slowly built up out of older forms, it follows that those nervous structures and connections, which have to do with higher intellectual processes, have been the most recently involved. Quote, consequently, there could be the least deeply organized and so the least stable, that is to say, the most liable to be thrown around or to combat. And in states of insanity, we see the process of nervous dissolution in taking reverse order of the process of evolution. Simply saying that, because we're experiencing these new things, we're moving at unknown speeds that humans haven't ever been able to do before, these sudden jolts of acceleration, we lose our ability to stay sane. And to some extent, I think that you can easily apply this kind of thought process to the internet today. Because again, we talked about it last time, how like the word nothing ever happens is a McLuhan-esque form of auto amputation of your senses, but also like our perception of history on this like digital like time scale. Like we had said that Sargon's had like 5 different lifetimes since Anita Sarkeesian called him a garbage human being at VidCon in 2017. And that was 7 years ago. But in this amount of time of 7 years, how much history has taken place? Or how much is your consciousness, even to the audience, how much of your political understanding or history of the world and your understanding of how much shit has happened has taken place in a short amount of time that it feels like millions of years have passed upon you? And you can see on the internet that some people just go absolutely fucking insane from this. I mean, what's a good example other than say, like, I don't know, James Lindsay's recent breakdown?
Yeah. Hold on, let me just say this. Your point that you were just making, I agree with 100%. I think it's better than the point he was making, because I didn't have a lot of notes from this section, especially when I did it on my show, because I didn't think it was particularly good. And I see what he's trying to say with railway spine, but I'm also like, well, I don't know, man. Do we have airplane spine? No, we fucking don't. Do we still have railway spine? Is that still a thing that we deal with? No. Maybe it was just a thing that kind of happened. He's trying to take like a thing he read about on Wikipedia and build the whole thing. Actually, you know what this was? This was modernity. No, asshole. It's just a weird thing you read about. You know what I mean? Your point's actually better because it has more meat to it. But it's like, I read about railway spine. Do you know what that could have been? That could have been like whiplash from too much traumatic technology. Well, you can't find evidence of that in any other fucking technology, asshole. I'm sorry. Sometimes this guy just annoys the shit out of me.
Well, I think that this part here is the most interesting because it has the most applicability to our technology today. And, like, can brain rot be digital whiplash? Absolutely. Like, yes, that is
Yes.
whiplash, because you can go from like just think about any sort of like the history of memes, from like rage comics to like the deep fried stuff to like the random noise to literally this skibbity catastrophism. Why not?
Well,
That's
that's
real.
why that's why like your thing, because it's the McLuhan thing, which is that as we extend ourselves, we have to auto amputate, and it changes us forever, and we have to adapt to it. Whereas his thing is like whiplash is like whoosh, and then you go back to normal. But no, like your thing is like
But he's not even saying that whiplash you go back to normal, because there are people who go through, and he's referencing the railway spine things. Like, some of these people could not take that kind of whiplash. It became a psychosomatic thing. Why? Well, they're giving you arguments as to why here with Sully and other people like Herbert Page. But I think that the thing that you can take a look at from this and extend it to today is that you could look at this from the view of Paul Virilio, right? Like the dramology, the study of acceleration and speed. The invention of the first train car also means that you have invented the first train derailment accident. And so in doing so, we have also invented, railway spine. We have also invented whiplash on a chronological and a psychiatric level in which we have not invented. So because of this, you have created a form of the accident through speed. And when that happens, he's quoting an X-Files character. Not that Sully. That's Dana Scully. Close
just
enough,
imagine
though, right?
Dana Scully listening to this. Mulder, you're saying that the spine is the universe realizing itself? Just imagine.
Mulder.
Why do we have a fucking AI Scully? Why aren't we doing anything right now?
I know, Dana Spiney.
Dana Spiney.
You've been talking to the lone gunman too much, Mulder. But I think that you can apply this though to our current form of technology, because even whether it's virtual reality, where some people kind of get like a motion sickness from it, or that it feels strange, where they get scared even though they're self-consciously aware of the fact that it's all fake, it's all VR, but it triggers those autonomic like fear factor aspects of it, right? And so I think what you can look at here of these things being, quote, chronobiological ailments is very true.
I think I return the fact.
Mm-hmm.
I think you're right. I don't think when people were first exposed to the telegraph, they got telegraph spine. That's all I'm saying. But I think your examples are better than his.
No, but I would probably argue, and I would probably need to do some research into it, but it's my gut feeling that once people in power or in positions to make money became regularly accessible to the telegraph, i.e., being able to process information faster than the average person from newspapers or from horseback news carriers, that they themselves experienced a kind of chronological disembodiment, or maybe I'll reference an anime or Serial Experiments Lane, where you're on the internet so much that time flies by on a scale outside of your time on the internet that doesn't feel like, oh, I've only been on for 20 minutes, and it's like, no, it's been like 6 days. Where the hell have you been? And that, I think, would have applied back then, and especially even now today. We have a perfect example of this with our timelines, where it's like, oh, like posts or even lost media people. They're like, oh, like so many things that have happened that are lost to time. We have to like find them through the record, and it throws you off track. It's like, whoa, this thing happened only 5 years ago and it's lost all of a sudden. I think that the chronobiological aspect can throw you into a whirlwind of consciousness that doesn't feel like you're grounded in anything. And that's why I think the auto amputation thing is so popular today, where we say nothing ever happens. And it's like, sir, this forum has been dead for 15 years. Why are you lamenting the death of bodybuilding.com? But like, because they're records of a previous era. And so, I think that it all builds off itself. This was the section that interested me the most.
Well, it gets into an interesting part here, as I'm sure you're going to get to this when he talks about mental illness as time travel, like we were discussing before.
Oh, like the devolution part?
Yeah, devolution. We talked about it with schizophrenia, but this is also
Yeah,
other,
here you go.
neurological time travel as an idea was just interesting to me because that's the one thing we haven't really brought up yet on either of these episodes we've done, which is how time travel relate. We kind of talked about time embodiment, but not actual time travel, and like regression as time travel is still like an interesting idea because if we do accept that as we're born, we progress through evolutions. Can we ever contract an ailment that causes us to de-evolve psychologically, maybe even physically?
Yeah, and again, it raises Prue dimes. This entire chat is actually a single schizophrenic spine. So true. So true.
And I'm not saying so true sarcastically either. That is so true.
It is very true. But I mean, this also explores the science fiction aspects a lot, where time travel, where you can only go backwards.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of some texts like that where we can only really go back in time, but you can never go to the future. It's a one-way ticket. And I mean, this is a lot of the papers in theoretical physics say that, you know, time travel is possible, but it is essentially one-way tickets because you can't ever return back to the future according to their models or whatever, you know,
Well, it's
because
an
you
interesting
can't create paradoxes or whatever.
it's an interesting way of looking at it because within this model, progressing into the future is evolution, it's advancement, it's awakening, and going into the past is always regression, devolution, sickness. So it not only it doesn't view time just as sort of a linear flow of events. To go back into the past is increasingly more trauma and increasingly worse, whereas proceeding in the future could only be better in a sense. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, I get what you're saying.
Yeah, I never heard like it qualitatively described like that before.
No, and this is what I find particularly interesting. For instance, you know, um, Jackson explicitly highlighted and commended the fact that his spinal striated model was models of madness removed normativity from medical diagnosis, just as Darwinism was removing teleology from morphology, emphasizing that devolution is never absolute but only relative, with lower level of evolution always remaining. It is, from this perspective of lower functioning, nothing more than healthy and normal. In other words, when one exhibits mania or delirium, it is only pathological from the perspective of the human parts of their nervous commonwealth. From the point of view our inner lizard, everything's just fine.
Yeah, no, I think that's very interesting. I don't really have any commentary on that. I just agree with it, I think.
Yeah, basically just like our idea of mental illness is just, oh, it's not human anymore. It's just, you know, this is the lizard brain talking. He's gone, Jim. You know, he's a lizard now.
Which is, I think
But this
you're
yeah, go
you're
ahead.
kind of bringing this into pop culture recently, and the news by mentioning James Lindsay, which we can return to if you'd like. But
No, it's okay.
um,
I'd rather not dive into that. I'm just going to let him, because now his whole thesis is actually we're all pawns of the CCP playing off of this like reactionary response, which to some extent is true. There are both the Russians and the Chinese know that America is an ethnic race war boiling pot that they can easily poke sticks at until it explodes. It's a viable national attack strategy where you don't have to really use resources; they can kill each other. But that's a whole
without
other
diving too much into this, I do want to. I think Nick Land, of all people, had the definitive commentary on James Lindsay when he simply said, and I'm paraphrasing, "What if he's actually just crazy?" And this was said a while ago, but like, what if James Lindsay is just an insane person and he's been insane this whole time, and now we're just seeing it? You know what I mean? Again, we all thought he was just kind of a kooky, weird, annoying, insufferable guy, but I think he's just insane. That's my take on everything I've seen from him. And now it's just come like Sam Harris or something. Like, have you just been a deluded piece of shit the whole time? Like, I think so. It was just kind of politically convenient that we put you in front of like, the Young Turks for a minute to complain about Islam. But no, you're fucking deranged, and you've always been deranged.
So perhaps this little section here would allow us to talk about that to some extent. Of course, we are now so acclimated to modernity's G-force loss of consciousness that upon what Ballard called the highways where we meet our deaths, those advanced causeways to global Armageddon, we barely notice the lurch of temporal decompression sickness anymore. We don't get the bends from how often we perceive how fast time is going, hence why we say nothing ever happens. It's become our pressure release valve via auto amputation. Perhaps these made up diseases didn't go extinct, but the condition has become a more permanent chronic one. According to Jackson, though, devolution and its relation to residual layers of evolution could take many different forms. Illness and wellness, even temporal positionality itself, is just a ratio between evolution and devolution. There are so many maladies there are relative ratios. So essentially, just we can go through time, but also we have tried to rapidly evolve and adapt to our environment, that we create ways to deal with that, the G-forces of acceleration, because our perception of time has been so accelerated that it's no longer just, oh, the evening news is off, the national anthem played, it's time to go to bed. No, now I can stay on Twitter and I can track how many people have died in Palestine in real time. That's an insane form of technological and perceptual acceleration that, we're going to eventually lose out on these lower animal forms of consciousness, to where no lower form of evolution remains. And if you buy into Nick Land and Meltdown, for example, that that things will go so fast that even the current form of human consciousness and perception of time will die off, to a point where Land famously wrote, "Nothing human survives the near future."
Well, that's an interesting point, and we return to Minsky and the model of advancing your cognitive capabilities up that pyramid, that you eventually lose conscious action of everything that was below it. It is possible to build up your faculties so much that you lose control over things that previously defined you as being a human. You can become so. And this is kind of what McLuhan was even talking about, like returning to the global village, becoming subsumed once again in total information overload, that you lose, they'll still be there, they'll still be functioning, but you're no longer aware of your own personality anymore, which is kind of a deterritorializing idea, I suppose.
And yeah, we get our reference back to that Mr. Barker, that fake Mr. We need to use him, like you said. We should just cite Barker and just say, like, oh, your fandom's upset? Well, we're going to treat, like, Charlie Barker like an SCP character, and he can just be whatever the fuck I want for this story, right?
A lot of people don't know this, but the Charles Barkers are free. You can just go take them home. I have 72 Barkers.
I've taken home 486 Charlie Barkers from Miskatonic Virtual University. But I like this. Perhaps it was one of those types of chronosthetic breakdowns that Barker was attempting to report upon his final manuscripts during the MVU period. A chittering tide devouring my hide, starting from the outside. This is the slide. Now cha-cha real smooth.
Let me just say this. If I can just, I'm going to say another unpopular opinion here. I am not a fan of any of these guys when they get into creative writing or science fiction. Like, and a few times even Nick Land has written just like kind of like sci-fi stories woven into the work, or like weird blog poetry. I hate it every time. I just don't enjoy it. Like that thing there, like the style where they just have these fragmented sentences annoys me. And I might have mentioned this before, and this is a extremely unpopular opinion. This is why I didn't like Meltdown, and I still don't really like Meltdown. And I've read a lot of his work. I like so much of Nick Land stuff. I can't fucking stand Meltdown, and everyone like turns on me when I say that. But I'm just putting that out there.
That's okay.
If anyone else has the bravery to admit that they don't like the fucking style of that, just this is a safe space.
It's okay. I don't like any of Curtis Yarvin's poetry.
Believe it or not, guys, Curtis Yarvin speaks better than he writes.
That's a hot take. It's a hot take I agree with. Do you have a lot of notes for this one?
No, honestly, I tend to stray away from having too many opinions on German idealism because there's too many assassins waiting in the darkness, waiting to take me down to that. So I don't really have much on this, to be honest.
Really, all that I do have to add here is that you have these natural philosophies. So cosmogeny, geology, zoogeny, psychology. Perhaps a symphonic climax. Basically, just that we have now a Teutonic art of war of natural sciences, and that German idealism can also be mapped to the diagram of the spine. So, like the natural philosopher could observe an orthograde posture like Bataille after them as a tautology of vegetal erection. Tautology, again, being a contemporary term for a symbol that somehow literally consubstantiates rather than merely mediates what it presents. Contemporaneously, the basis of this literality and consubstantiation was often glossed as consisting in genetic relation of phylation, inheritance, and recapitulation. As for Schelling wrote, just as the plant bursts forth into bloom, so the entire earth blossoms in the human brain, nature's most sublime flower. And again, we got the lovely vagina-looking spinal flower at the top of the brain. But in this instance, we're referencing, because again, a lot of this is building off of a lot of German psychiatry, a lot of German and Jewish psychologists and so on, as well as German idealism, which of course has its own bear trap waiting to just like bite my fucking leg off. But at the same time, right, like you're looking at this and he's just simply saying like, oh, we have these ideas that can sort of form into a spine that we can map these ideas and these philosophies and these schools of thought into, and it culminates to the top of the head. And again, we're kind of seeing this sort of like cosmogenic understanding as well, like, oh, the archetype of the head is actually shaped as a planet because it contains a world, so it must morphologically resemble one. And all of a sudden we can see this throughout the history of like German philosophy and ideas and naturalism. And that's really all I have much to add on this part here to explain the section.
To be honest, these past couple of sections are him, trying to justify the earlier sections by saying, here's many great minds who've also spoken of the spine, this relationship. He kind of restates the premises here, which I'm sure that you need, and you would be inclined to include that. I would just as soon as him not even include that. I would just as soon as read a book like this with no real citations whatsoever. I would tolerate it if it was all just fucking Barker. I would, you know what I mean? Like, I don't necessarily need.
I want a Barker book so bad.
Yeah, like we don't need to go into all these other kind of cherry picked commentaries on, here's another guy who said that the spine is memory. I'm like, okay, we get it. And right at the end here, it kind of restates it. Just to summarize, I found this part interesting. We shy away from glances into the abysses of the past which remain within us as much as the present. These unfathomable depths are what is oldest in nature, its inorganic and uninhabitable past. For the first time, the body was unraveled into an exploded constellation of divergent tempos and heterochronies. In the bones of animals, the soils are hardened and their veins conduct metallic content. Comparative anatomy becomes chronolocomotion. Bones are genuine transportations of the inorganic past into the organic present. Each organ an epoch suspended. Recapitulation granularizes and modularizes monolithic time, disarticulating embodiments, continuities, and homogeneities into radically divergent moments. So again, he's kind of building on the things we had talked about in the past, but he does bring up this interesting idea of inorganic past and organic present. And once again, restating this idea that everything in the past is dead. Some of us might say, the past is a nation you can no longer inhabit, but he also, and maybe this is his political inclination, like the past is something you should never even want to look towards in a sense. That's at least my reading on it.
Yeah, and again, I think that he's also using this to build off of the German philosophers, and that at the top, like German idealism is also like where we will eventually find ourselves nested in with the brain. And again, this also is a sort of my weaker part. I have not read as many of the Germans as I would like to. I've read quite a bit of Nietzsche. I have tried my best to go through Hegel. I feel like a retard sometimes when I read through him, just because it requires me to go through it more densely than I ever had to with the French post-structuralists. Like I can read through 1,000 plateaus and I can get it, but then I think a lot of it has to do with the translation from German into English. Like reading through Hegel just takes me a lot. But a lot of these sources I want to go through and now read. These are my favorite parts about these kind of books. Is this like, okay, you have some crazy ideas, but now I have this like lovely cross section of like stuff I want to read now. Like Schelling, the philosophical rupture between Fichte and Schelling. Like I want to go read that now. Like I probably will. I will probably buy that text.
I think that's why. Who was it who said that our next book needs to be the Anti-Epictetus by Deleuze and Gautier? You know what I mean? Like we
Yeah.
I've never read that, but I've read enough stuff built upon that I might as well.
You
go back to
should,
that.
and I need to reread it because I have not read Anti-Oedipus in about 7 years, so I need to reread it.
It's funny, like we over the many episodes we've done together, we're always reviewing this really trippy, cool, interesting, like a lot of times pretty fringe stuff, and it's like for our next act, we're just gonna read Hegel, and then most fucked up, twisted shit. A lot of people say Hegel is the corn of philosophy. That's what the word on the street is. People are talking about that.
Well, we'll have maybe we should. That'll be our next project on Do You Even Read series. Will be either Hegel or Anti-Oedipus. Either which way, it'll be exciting. But this last one, Cosmic History, is a series of obstacles to the three tiny little bones inside your ears, the smallest bones in the human body, to pick up vibration and to pick up sound. And so, of course, we open up with Samuel Taylor Coleridge. He was also an ambitious philosopher. He's more than a poet. This is very true. So following this guiding thread ultimately led him into the deep, dark groundwork of our nature, plagued by personal demons, many resulting directly from his philosophical investigations. He never quite successfully transmitted this into print. His systematic vision of what there is of it remains fragmented throughout his voluminous private notebooks. Nevertheless, he was an astute, syncretic, yet wildly idiosyncratic thinker. And so he talks about Coleridge. He says, he remarked that the history of man for the 9 months preceding his birth would probably be far more interesting and contains events of greater moment than all of the life that follows. He thereafter envisioned a Shandian situation by which the writings of the fetal epitome would take about 4,000 years, easily filling 300 volumes, and thus the hapless author would die in a dream before they even reached their birth. This, of course, became the prenatal comprises of the whole cosmic evolution. Having recently studied post-Kantian philosophy, Coleridge had the tools and determination to write his prenatal chronicle, or the omniscible of human nature, what we are and what we become and what we are. And yet, of course, this never happens. But he was a tutophile. But the sort of idea of, again, now we're going back towards the stuff that was mentioned in Thoracic Retrospect, which is that we're building off these like formalist iterations, because like, if we go back and look at fetal development, then we can see that virtually the fetuses of all kinds of animals, including humans, all have a formographic, they're all resembling a prototype. And what does that prototype look like? And that offers us some kind of history and a philosophical understanding of where we came from. Again, very materialist, very much the naturalist, take out the teleology of Western Christianity, and let's just dive into what we can maybe investigate as well as what we can observe.
Yeah, and I'm just going to be a real fucking party pooper here again, where, he's quoting Thomas Brown there. Coleridge saying that, the field development, it would cut 4,000 years describing that epitome, fill 300 volumes. I'm like, no, it wouldn't. Like, I get what you're saying. That's wrong. Like, just shut up. Like, you know what I mean? Like, that's going too far with the poetry. The fetus in a second lives 12 lifetimes. No, it doesn't. That's shut up. Sorry.
But again, this is where I think some of the real schizo stuff comes out. And I say that both tongue in cheek, but also like, the meme of like, damn, bitch, you live like this. It's also like, damn, dude, you think like this? Like, but again, it's interesting to look at it. For me, like my moral and my teleological like grounding is already firmly anchored on the rock. I'm not too worried about this driving me mad. But as Kant might point out with agonism, like this would probably drive someone up a fucking wall. And I did watch a YouTube review of this book, and it's like an hour and 20 minutes long. It's an 80-minute review where he's like, this thing broke me. And I'm like, I see. Filtered, like,
Yeah.
whereas I can look at this and read it, find this really interesting, but also be like, there's a little sketchy shit here,
Oh yeah. I just saw these this fucking tweet thread that was documenting all these women who had just discovered Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy, and just imagine, like, I never imagined a woman reading Blood Meridian, but they're like, this book was traumatizing to me. Like, but when you read Blood Meridian, it's not even that bad. It's not, but to like a fucking female lit professor, I could understand that might warp your
break
mind.
You. Yeah. I do, but some of the writing here is really, I appreciate it. For instance, Oken indeed had said that the skeletal system is the reappearance of planetism within the human. In Coleridge's eyes, the physical hardness of the insensitive nail thus could be accounted for as a type of temporal non-linearization. One only need to look at Deleuze's fingernails. Like, notably, the German word for vertebra, verbal, also denotes spiral or vortex, each osseous whirl of cyclone and time. The bones of the human ear furnish a remarkable instance of such retrotion. Coleridge noted that hearing depends on the vibrations or rock-hard adamantine bones. Sound propagates through solids, thus even deaf people hear through skeletal transmission, he pondered. Thus one can arrive at the profound derivation of the audible form, zu metallic. Thus sound is volatile metal, he glossed, envisioning that hearing arises from the sonority of miniature mountain ranges. And again, now you're getting the whole idea that, like, the human, and by extension, cosmic stuff, these vibrations, these catastrophic instances of trauma that all hit upon each other. Bodies are temporal manifolds, yet our ability to sound can splinter and break, but at the same time, when we break through, we can hear things that, again, going back to the bicameral mind, or we can hear, like, the voice of God, we can hear all sorts of strange things that would allow us to understand that the world is much greater and built very similar to ourselves, that we can understand it anatomically, but also physiologically.
Which is interesting when you consider what Moynihan says about, like, the purpose of intelligence is to distance ourselves from trauma. Similarly, transhumanism is to distance us from death. It's to, auto amputation kind of numbs our senses as we extend them, but in a sense, we're numbing our senses all the fucking time. So you could imagine a future where we've numbed ourselves to all forms of reverberations and we've shut our minds off to every sense except what we are plugged into.
Yeah, absolutely. Going beyond the hypotheses of the Victorian doctors who treated railway spine, he thus went on to diagnose nervous diseases as the recidivist eruption of anti-organic activity in the nerves, so pre-organic, pre-sentient. Disease just does not relapse into prior organic state, but also the resurgence of prior inorganic ones. Central nervous system degeneration, again, chronopathic decentralization, describing such time sicknesses as relapses of nature sinking back from the organic and the vivific. Coleridge similarly anticipated Hartmann and Ferenczi, classifying somnolent states as precisely that sink back into the mind into inanimate material. Basically, we can go back even further in time to where there isn't even, protoplasmic material that could once provide organic life. Like, this is how far back in time we're going. We're, again, like the chapter says, cosmic history.
And also, like, you see there, he also mentions the present is organic, but every time we regress into something, it is synthetic, and synthetic just meaning the inverse of the organic. And that's just one of those anchor ideas that I always come back to. Like, maybe that's like the one thing that I'll never be able to agree with him on, but that to really lose yourself in this, you have to really believe that everything historical is inorganic and everything of the present is the only thing that's alive, that there is no utility to anything in the past. And I don't know, it's just, I keep seeing that pop up, especially in this chapter, or this section rather.
And chat has been very interesting as of late.
What are you looking at here?
Teaching a free course on spinal catastrophism, proof of schizophrenia diagnosis required to attend. It's like big fan of your work, clearest sign of mental illness, Nick Land. The informational equivalent of that is the Land Shark ayahuasca tweet. I love Land Shark. He's one of my favorite posters. Hazel is partially, I think, teasing me here, but I think it's true. Like, go ahead, spout your schizoid ramblings. I have Jesus Christ. It's true. I do. Like, I go to sleep knowing I have objectively correct beliefs. Like, I'm fine. This stuff does not, like, threaten me in any way, like, in terms of my psychosecurity. I just find this stuff to be really interesting to read. It's like, these are what these people are thinking about,
Well, we got Big Ben with a heater here. There's a scandal in the chess world where cheaters are shoving things up their bum so they can hear/feel external signals, and anal telepathy is the future. I mean, a great post from a great man.
A great post from a great man talking about teledildonics.
Teledildonics.
It's a real word. Go look that up.
Hey, fucking Moynihan, you're not getting this on your other streams.
Like, literally, or also known as cyberdildonics, is a name coin for virtual sex encounters using networked electronic sex toys to mimic and extend human sexual interaction. It was originally known after Howard Rheingold used it in his 1991 book, Virtual Reality. And now I think it's also been referenced throughout the whole chess stuff. The Electronic Frontier Foundation named one such patent the stupid patent of the month when it came to the word. But there you go. I bet you didn't know that. Enjoy. There's your $5 word. There is your word-winning triple word score on Scrabble. Teledildonics.
Hey, that's a $5 word. That's a $30 Canadian word. That's what that
That's
is.
very true. That's why it's cheap to support your friends over at Blood Satellite, because I literally pay jack shit to support Real Secret Coffee Hours.
He's paying my son's way through college with that American money monthly.
Hazel says, I'm only half teasing. I'm also Orthodox. Well, there you go. That's fine. It was a slanderous hoax, by the way, about the chess thing. But still, it is kind of interesting.
I refuse to believe someone hasn't tried that, though.
Oh, I wouldn't be surprised if someone is like, listen here, buddy. This is a Bluetooth-operated plug. And if you feel something, it means you're making the wrong move.
Like, these are chess guys. The first strategy they have for everything is putting it in their ass. That's why the chess pieces are shaped that way.
You won't get that anywhere else.
You hear that, Moynihan? You son of a bitch.
I like how this has just turned into like a very angry, rant against the author. But anyways, in one notebook entry extolling human uprightness, his philosophical demons got the better of him. Man alone seems drawn upward, his base narrower than his shoulders. Coleridge wrote, he stoops to procure in acts of laboring and eating, but he enjoys with his face and eyes fronting his fellow man in social intercourse. However, Coleridge's jubilation abruptly segues into troubled rumination, now in Latin for purposes of secrecy, on how the ventral fumblings of sexual intercourse destroys this uprightness. His eyes from above are now cast down towards the earth. The fornicator becomes once more the servant of nature and earth, tearing himself away from such carnal visions. He concludes by ejaculating, man is truly a solar animal.
You hear that, vitalists? Vitalism mentioned.
There you go. The headward we gravitate towards the sun. But, and as Bataille later declared, however, such celestial orientation merely combusts into precocious futurity and the calcification of your penile. We got everything going here, buddy. Thinking like a planet will only give you brain sand.
I love that he'll pepper those in there, just a sentence to bring it home. Yeah, thinking like a planet will give you brain sand. I bet that same thought occurred to me at various points in this.
Yeah, we have it's like brain dune. Inside your brain there's the giant sandworms that one day they must be conquered. I don't have too much to add to this section here, other than now we're talking about cosmic history, and that these philosophers, both Goethe, Bataille, Coleridge, are looking at romanticism. Romanticism is where spinal catastrophism proper is first ignited. Intimation stretched from the era's beginning to its end already in 1784, when the Parisian diarist Louis Sebastian Messier wrote of an uninterrupted tradition of ancient antient disasters running from visible traces of profound ruins and devastations, which are spread over the surface of the earth all the way into the terrors that are subtly engraved in the fiber of human brains. By 1845, De Quincey was talking about the convulsions that inscribe themselves successively upon the palimpsest of your brain, an endless strata of forgetfulness, precisely as primary convulsions of geohistory successfully scarred our dark planet. For De Quincey, who also noticed the virtual time of dreams was ridiculous to compute in scales commensurate with human life, that must instead be measured in eons and diameters of the earth. Certain minds are undoubtedly truer than others and are great magnet to our dark planet, essentially mapping cosmic and geological and earth history inside our subconscious, and that somehow these records of time on a cosmic scale can also be brought inside of our brain and are etched in our spinal columns and our bones, and in doing so we will feel the primal beginnings of the earth, and that romanticism, especially in Goethe, and you see this in our cyclical historians as well, that there is a romanticism of life at the beginning of the spring stage in which anyone can become. And we fear that once we calcify our pineal gland, we too also enter those frozen, icy stages of winter on a civilizational scale, where Spengler writes about the Chinese.
Ooh, here's voice go there. It's passionate. It gave me chills.
I'm trying to make this entertaining for you bastards.
No, it is. But like, to me, like, there's some great points in this second part. But to me, this was the least interesting part of the three. There's some good stuff here, but it was more, like I said, restating the premise. It was adding some, some background information. It was adding citing some sources, which is good. However, like, I'm a bit more excited about the third one that does tie a lot of this together and really takes it more, in my mind at least, into the cosmic realm. Because within this entire second section, we're teasing at the interplay between, the human mind and the cosmic mind, and sort of the linking between the actual human spine and the planet. And so, like, this is kind of a setup to me for the third part. So I didn't have too much written about this when I first talked about it, but if for the types of people who are looking for more philosophical and historical grounding, I think this is an important part for that anyway.
Yeah, and this part is particularly interesting to me because it throws in cosmogenesis. It throws in these ideas of how history can also be mapped to the spine in a diagram, but also that there's this like deep romanticism to it, especially towards that period of history. And I'll read this last section here, and then we can sort of conclude in our discussion here. But Goethe writes, I felt for the first time that I envied the poets, for in speaking of primal beginnings, he proclaimed that we should speak primally, i.e. poetically, in a theoretical framework within which individual consciousness was interpretable only as a retrograde amnesia for its own pre-conscious cosmogenesis. There could not be but a porous border between geo-gnostic investigation, we're looking into like secret knowledge, but also through in the history of the earth and our own record of history and time, and a poetic enthusiasm. Precisely this porosity looks forward to many of the figures we have explored in our own secret history, from Ballard to Velikovsky. Yet in order to finally locate the very first kindling of the notion of spinal catastrophism, we must travel back before Romanticism and a spat between the tutor and his tutee. And we'll get into that in the next section. In the next episode here, but we've been going for about 2 hours now. But I feel like that's a good place that we can probably wrap up here, and then we can finish the section in a couple of weeks. But what are your thoughts? Concluding thoughts, ramblings, ideas.
Just to build off of the last thing I said, which was about how this might have been, of the three, my least liked part. I do appreciate the tying together of so many different sources. He will layer, philosophers with scientists, both real and imagined, and poets and academics, and kind of level them completely. And in most serious academic works, they wouldn't do that, but that's what appeals to me about this sort of writing, that it sees these as interchangeable, and it would bring poetry and science fiction into this realm equally. And I see that as a feature, not a bug. That's something that I think a lot of people in our spaces employ as well. And I think that's a distinctly like 21st century way to do things. We can pull from so many strange esoteric sources, like to bring in George Bataille. So for people who don't know him, we covered him on our show. He's like a fucking like Marxist occultist. Like he's out of his fucking mind. He did like satanic rituals and orgies and shit. And he wrote a very interesting book, The Accursed Share, about the purpose of like the economic use of human sacrifice across time. Like interesting stuff. But to see him alongside Schopenhauer and then alongside a made up guy and then alongside Freud, I like that. I don't want to come across as me being disparaging towards that.
Yeah, no, and I find this particularly interesting to see how he's tied the history of German idealism and its own romantic philosophy to Bataille, to Goethe, to Samuel Taylor Coleridge, to Nick Land, and Deleuze. Like to me, this is a pretty impressive tome, just for how much he's pulling here. And I don't want to say he's pulling it like, oh, he's pulling it out of his ass. I want to say that for a guy who wants to take plutonics, but then apply it to the brain, how we can envision our own, we've outsourced this like synthetic ganglion of being able to think about ourselves in the future. So now all of a sudden that means that we can foresee our own death and extinction on a cosmic scale. And of course, that makes me want to read his second book. But I'm thoroughly impressed with this. And again, to me, this is really interesting shit. Even if it's kind of like schizo gobbledygook.
The way that you and I engage with it, it's we read it seriously, but we engage with it more like a vibe. We engage with like, hey, this is cool. I can vibe with this. I dig this. It's kind of like jazz. It's kind of like EDM jazz. There's parts of it I don't like, but it's not enough to. The parts I don't like don't break it for me. It does. I can take out the parts I do like and appreciate it just as this kind of weird thing I found and extract. The entire idea behind this or behind trauma rather, is that you experience these things and it impacts you later. So like, even if I don't subscribe to it, I have been changed by it. I've been traumatized by spinal catastrophism. And even if I don't like it or like all of it, like it does change you kind of, you bring this sort of thing with you in life, whether you want to or not.
Yes, you did just hear a reference to EDM jazz. So a couple of super chats came in just about now. I'm going to go read through them real quick, and then we will plug and play our usual links. AA's Evil Twin says very generously for $20. He says, I enjoyed your... Well, I didn't really crucify him. I just disagreed with his take of James Lindsay on Oren's stream the other day, and you deserve compensation for wrangling Geo each week. Well, thank you for the $20. I don't know how I feel about all those words, but I appreciate your kindness to offer me $20. Really, all I will say about the whole James Lindsay thing is that I know he doesn't like it, but pray for the man. I think that he needs it. I really don't have much to say about him.
I can say some stuff. I thought we all knew James Lindsay was a fucking retard. You know what I mean? Like I'm hearing people like, okay, what can we do about James Lindsay? I thought we've been shitting on him for like 5 years because he's never had a good point.
Well, the problem is that you read some of his criticisms, like there's like an inkling of what's true. Like there is a transhumanist aspect to it. Is there a bit of Gnosticism in there? Yes, but like also at the same time, your takeaway is that only classical American classical liberalism can overcome the reaction to communism and fascism. If we've learned anything from the history of American liberalism, it clearly lost to communism. Like, I'm sorry, the limited suffrage, private and free association, private property rights, limited franchise, the ability to separate and to legally enforce that. Oh, you mean the classical liberalism of like 1920s America? We have that? No, we don't. He is there an inkling of some truth to what he's like talking about? Yes. Is he right? No, because he's going off on the wrong track, because he cannot let the liberal project fail, because that would mean his entire life's work and everything that he's ever done is incorrect. And once you've made yourself a career out of that and you cling to the rock of credentialism and a PhD, you're never going to go anywhere from there. And I think that it's just, I think he lives in his own hell, because he talks about like neo-Marxist Gnosticism, and you're trying to tell this to a bunch of evangelical preachers at TPUSA conferences, and you hate Christians. Okay, man, like you live in a hell of your own making.
Yeah, and just to put it another way, at this stage in the game, at this point of everything, you don't spare yourself a fucking bullet just because you say the woke have gone a bit too far. That's all he's been selling for a long time. So fuck this guy. I'm sick of him. We need to be meaner to James Lindsay. You don't. Let me say this without. Let me phrase this properly so it doesn't sound like a threat. No, you're not mean to James Lindsay enough. None of you are. None of us are. We need to be meaner. Like he shouldn't fucking be here. He's got the face of a guy who got fired from a used car dealership. He wears the wrong type of pants. He's like fucking Arthur Chu. He puts his shoes on wrong. He's never had an interesting thing come out of his head. Why the fuck do we have James Lindsay on the tips of our tongues? Why do we have him in our minds? We must excise him. We have to cancel him from fucking existence. There's so many more deserving, retarded assholes we could be talking about than James Lindsay.
So true, Sean. So true. I bring a certain spinal catastrophist vibe that other academics really don't like. That's very true. Charlie Mackey says, "Damn, I'm late to the stream that made my back hurt. Thank goodness we don't have exoskeletons that cause we don't have exoskeletons that would cause the uncomfortable self-awareness of my spine and bones. Would be so much worse if it was all my skin instead. I hope that you gentlemen are both doing well."
This is why Orrin McIntyre won't have me on the show, because he knows I'm going to go into detail on the spinal catastrophism I'd bring to James Lindsay.
Eventually he should. He needs to have some more Canadians on there. And then of course,
once again, I apologize. This has turned into direct actionable threats. I didn't want to.
Yes,
thank
please.
God Jay was not here to put this behind the paywall.
Yes, thank you. And then Bobby says, "Hail, Ola Lordy, owner of the Lord." I'm not sure what you're referencing there, buddy, but appreciate the super chat nonetheless. So with that being said, Mr. Dimes of Blood Satellite, one half of a wonderful show, where can people find you and your wonderful work?
Oh, well, thanks again for taking the time to speak to me today. I love doing these shows with you. I can be found at bloodsatellite.ca is the main website. I got my Twitter handle there at Legally Ironic. Also, our store is Good Suffer. It's the goodsufferstore.com. Sell a whole bunch of merchandise on there. And my Substack is at vanguardistjournal.substack.com. And that's all the plugs I'm going to do for right now.
And the link to the Blood Satellite show is in the description of this video, and it will be in the description of all podcasts that this will be on of your favorite platforms, whether you're on Libsyn, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and the rest. Look for the amphibious PFP that you see on screen, as well as it is known on other podcast platforms, Prudent Observations with the Prudentialist. You will see me there on all your favorite platforms, Substack included. My Substack is linked down there. The prudentialist.substack.com. Also writing for the Old Glory Club. So if you are interested in Hurricane Helen disaster relief funding, you of course have seen our streams fundraising for that, but I also have a piece called The Long Road to Recovery, in which you can read to understand how the disaster relief funding works in the long run. And if you are in Florida, or if you are in parts of what has already been hit by Hurricane Helen and you're going to get hit by Hurricane Milton, just do everything that you can to stay safe. Your life is far more important than you realize. Please take care of it. And I think we will just see you all next time on another edition of Do You Even Read, where we finish Thomas Moynihan's Spinal Catastrophism, A Secret History. We'll see you all next time.